This paper began life as a contribution to a recent conference on Bernard Williams's legacy for philosophy today. And I was specifically asked to present something on how the ongoing study of ancient Greek philosophy or ancient Greek ethics might benefit from thinking about themes from Bernard Williams. I think the direction of benefit was supposed to be from Bernard Williams to everything else that people contributed about at this conference. However, the paper is still a work in progress, or at least I hope that progress is the right word. I'm going to look at a specific question in ancient Greek ethics with the help of perspectives developed by Bernard Williams in some of his most influential inquiries. The question is, my main question here is the place of theoretical activity in human life, and I'll be referring to Aristotle. Williams is relevant through one strand in his skepticism about what he called morality, the peculiar institution. This is a strand that suggests questions not merely about Aristotle, but also not merely about Aristotle, but questions that it would be interesting to put to Aristotle and see how he would or should respond to them. Williams focuses on the way in which morality, in its traditional self-presentation, claims to set up sovereign demands. No conflicting consideration can trump the call of moral duty. This is not, of course, the thought that it's our duty always to obey a moral rule, such as promise-keeping, regardless of cost. For morality, the peculiar institution, certainly allows in general that what counts as our actual duty in a given situation depends on the circumstances. Rather, the idea is that once moral thinking has determined what I in my situation should do, then as far, or at least when it's determined what I should do as far as morality is concerned, there cannot be a good reason, let alone a better reason, for me to do anything else. Kant seeks to make this a necessary truth by, in fact, defining good fundamental practical reasoning as good moral reasoning, a piece of Kantianism that can actually, in this context, be taken on board by consequentialist moralists or philosophers, because that point has to do with the overridingness of moral duty and doesn't depend on how we determine what the duty is or what duty happens to dictate. Obviously, consequentialists differ very much from Kant in their sort of decision procedure, but this is to do with the overridingness of duty, moral duty, once it has been determined. Williams famously casts doubt on this claim of necessary overridingness on the part of morality. He argues that human beings can be involved in non-moral projects and commitments which they may, on occasion, have good reason to pursue, even at the expense of duty. The famous Gauguin example, which Williams explores in the paper Moral Luck, it's an example of several sort of philosophical issues, but this is one of the issues it's supposed to illustrate. So my first question for Aristotle is whether he would or could take comfort from Williams's thesis about morality not necessarily being overriding. Putting the question slightly differently, could Aristotle recognize his own ethical stance on theoretical activity, the activity of sophia, which is the virtue of theoretical wisdom? Could Aristotle recognize his own stance on this as confirmation of Williams's belief that we may have good reason to pursue something even at the expense of our duties of justice and other duties that fall within the sphere of the ethical as distinct from the intellectual? Now, why does this question even arise? It arises because Aristotle maintains that the activity of theoretical wisdom is more godlike and precious and honourable and so forth than any other activity, whether practical or recreational, and he maintains that the life devoted to this pursuit, the pursuit of theoretical wisdom, is the happiest. So he says that just in so many words. This view, this position commits him to the view that the activity of theoretical wisdom is the highest human end, and it seems clear that Aristotle is not just committed to this, but is very happy to affirm it. The position is developed rather fast and furiously in the almost last chapters of his Nicomachean Ethics, with very little said in advance that would prepare the reader for this really rather astonishing ending. And many have found this astonishing ending very disturbing. Some 20th century interpreters worried that Aristotle is implicitly condoning or even supporting the pursuit of theoretical wisdom, even at the expense of duties to fellow citizens, family members, and so forth. Or else that they worried that he is implicitly recommending that those who try to lead the life of theoretical wisdom should live like monks or hermits with no sort of civic or family environment. Shock and horror at this impression of Aristotle's theoretical ideal have led a number of scholars to try to explain away the passages that appear to support it. But another way of letting Aristotle off the hook here might consist in lining him up with Williams's rejection of the necessary supremacy of morality, assuming, of course, that the sophistication of Williams's approach really does succeed in reducing our shock and horror. The idea, the sort of Williams-like idea, would be that Aristotle's theoretical sage needn't be a monk or hermit. He could have the ordinary duties to city and family, etc. But it would still be very reasonable and perhaps even very admirable of him to set aside, in fact, even to neglect those duties in the interest of theoretical work. So my first question is, would we do well to reach for that alignment with Williams in order to vindicate Aristotle? The answer, I think, is no. In other words, Aristotle's elevation of the theoretical ideal does not provide confirmation of what Williams would be maintaining 24 centuries later. The reason for this negative answer is that Aristotle's texts enable us to see him in a way that gets him off the hook without resorting to the Williams move. The basis for this is the connection which Aristotle several times draws in the Ethics and the Politics between theoretical activity and leisure. He proposes theoretical activity as the supremely appropriate occupant of what I'm just going to call the leisure sphere, the sort of leisure part of life for those who have it. The leisure sphere is an area or a place which many people populate with nothing but trivial and even personally harmful pleasures, or else with pastimes that really just constitute a needed pause from practical toil. Now, my point is that there is no reason why we shouldn't take Aristotle to view leisure as something that kicks in only when there are no conflicting duties of justice and so forth. A morally good person, and this for Aristotle is the kind of person whose judgment is canonical in any ethical matter, a morally good person would not regard herself or himself as being at leisure at a time where they're supposed to be attending to some important practical duty, whether to the city, to the family, or maybe of a prudential nature. Aristotle's highlighting of the theoretical life, as distinct from just the odd sort of burst of theoretical activity, surely implies that those who take his lesson to heart will arrange things so as not to undertake a lot of the ambitious and strictly unnecessary social obligations in which many people immerse themselves. And since in general, obviously all this is just in general, this can be done without riding roughshod over the basic core of moral duties, there is nothing in the text that forces us to see Aristotle as holding, along with Williams, that the theoretical sage has good reason to ignore anything in the core, what I'm calling the core of moral duties. The interpreters who worried that Aristotle's elevation of the theoretical ideal condones neglect of family, dodging of burdens such as military service, and even fraud I think this was an example of Elizabeth Anscombe's fraud committed to get money for research. The interpreters, who quite reasonably worried that Aristotle is committed to all of that, or to condoning all those things, they were almost certainly assuming a particular model of what it is to regard something as the highest human end. For Aristotle, theoretical activity is the highest human end. According to the model which I believe they were all using, which is given tremendous mileage by John Stuart Mill in the first paragraph of Utilitarianism, and has also been given a sort of indirect boost by Kant, which I won't try to go into. For an end, let's just call it E, to be highest, is for it to be the determinant of morally right action. That is, an action is right or subjectively right if and only if it is or is reasonably judged to be optimal for producing end E. The view that results from substituting E with the activity of theoretical wisdom is not only grotesque in itself, but I think I'm right in saying there is no independent evidence for ascribing it to Aristotle. That is, there is no independent evidence for ascribing to him the view that an action or a type of action represents the morally right thing to do just because it is optimal for promoting the activity of theoretical wisdom. However, Aristotle is not committed to this position except on the assumption that the only coherent way to treat some end E as the highest good is to assign it that role of determinant of all right action. But this is a gratuitous assumption for several reasons. One reason is philosophers can leave aside the question. I here, as it were, falling back on Ross's distinction between the right and the good, which I've always found an extremely helpful distinction in many ways. So philosophers can leave aside the question of rightness, that is moral rightness, altogether, and still ask, concerning the various goods in human life, which of them deserves to be considered the paramount good. So such philosophers may embrace the view that for E to be the paramount good is for E to be the good which ought to be maximally promoted, but it's the good which ought to be maximally promoted. But this says only that the pursuit of other goods should always be subordinate to the pursuit of E. It does not say that promotion of E should always take precedence over all practical considerations whatsoever. Thus, the view allows us to keep a promise simply because it's a promise, just a sort of deontological thing. So simply because it's a promise, let's suppose there are no extraordinary circumstances, it allows us to keep a promise just because it's a promise without giving any thought, without our giving any thought to whether keeping or breaking the promise leads to better results in terms of E. So that's an example of, as it were, the application of the right, the morally right, which simply, according to certain ethical positions, doesn't, as it were, necessarily entail any views about maximizing the good. Another point is that there can be and have been ways of treating E as the highest good that don't involve pursuing E to the maximum, even as compared with other goods. So several philosophers have noted in recent years that there are ways in which human beings can honor, I just use that word as a sort of kind of slightly umbrella term, they can honor something most or regard it as most precious and valuable of all the goods that there are. And there are ways of having this attitude and expressing this attitude that are other than looking to maximize the whatever it is, either in one's own life or in general. So arguably, we may find it hard to take this seriously, but nonetheless, I think there is an argument here. Arguably, for example, one will be honoring some end E most if one approaches it as the most godlike a possibility available in human life. And this is, in fact, if we read those chapters almost at the end of the Ethics, this is how Aristotle does see the activity of theoretical wisdom. Another way of treating E as the highest good would be to treat it, and this is a Kantian point, of course, as the condition of value of all the other goods. None of the other goods is worth anything unless in the context of a life that's suffused with some sort of a concern for the highest good, or even has achieved the highest good. For Kant, of course, that highest and unconditional good is the goodwill, so the will that wants to do its moral duty just for the sake of doing it, or just because it's the right thing to do. But these practical interpretations of the idea that E is the highest good do not entail seeking to promote E under all circumstances, even at the expense of recognized duties or at the expense of all other goods. In fact, I seem to remember there was a period when there were articles in Mind all the time about whether it would be one's moral duty to promote moral dutifulness as widely as possible, even if in order to do it you had to tell a lie or do one of those things. And I imagine, I don't know whether Kant deals with this question, but I imagine for him it could never be right to try to promote anything, not even moral dutifulness or the goodwill, if it meant doing something morally wrong oneself. This is a complicated topic, and here I'm only sketching possible positions. But the main point for now is that if we allow Aristotle to be operating in terms of one or another of these alternative models of what it is for something to be the highest good, and if in addition we understand leisure in an intelligent way, then we can attribute to him large swathes of common sense morality, including the assumption that the basic core of morality always has the first claim on us, while at the same time allowing him the preeminence that he accords to the life of theoretical wisdom. So he doesn't need Williams to help him out of some pit that he's dug for himself. We don't have to see it as a pit, and etc. That said, we can all the same sketch a sort of convergence between this ideal, the theoretical ideal of Aristotle's, and Williams's skepticism about the necessary overridingness of moral duty. Each philosopher is seeking to liberate his audience from the grip of a stiflingly powerful idea which comes embedded in a host of emotions and expressions that are widely shared, or at least are paid lip service to, throughout the respective culture. With Williams, the adversary descends from a conception of morality as in fact a sort of religion or substitute for religion, one whose claim on its adherence, and of course all rational beings should be its adherents, annihilates any rival consideration, very much in the style of the monotheistic God. Aristotle's adversary is the notion that the pinnacle of human existence this may seem to us quite weird today really, but the pinnacle of human existence is successful political leadership. Of course, this notion itself can be and was interpreted in a range of more and less crude and more and less subversive ways. But at any rate, quite a widespread idea in the culture, Aristotle's culture, certainly in Plato's time too, the idea was that this, namely becoming a great political leader, is the only serious goal for those who entertain the ambition of leading truly excellent and admirable lives. So that anyone who sets aside this ambition, who might otherwise have pursued it, who was in a position to pursue it, is just a wimp or an eccentric or not a fully grown-up person. And again, we might find this, as it were, difficult to believe of those terribly rational Greeks, etc. But there's very considerable evidence from both the philosophical literature and non-philosophical literature, late 5th century and sort of 4th century. There's considerable evidence that this was a standard view. You know, if you have any sort of gumph in you, then what you'll go for is political leadership. The fact that Aristotle's theoretical ideal is put forward as an alternative to a certain notion of the absolute pinnacle of human existence shows that in this part of his ethics, he's moved beyond ethics for ordinary citizens. I mean, not everybody can dream of, or they can dream, but not everybody has a hope of attaining the absolute pinnacle of human existence. So Aristotle is now, in this part of his work, promoting one kind of extraordinary and iconic achievement or contribution against another. So he's promoting the, as it were, rather under-recognized in those days theoretical ideal against the widely recognized political ideal. By contrast, the quasi-religious approach to morality, which Williams is countering, tends to focus away from extraordinary achievement. More important for this approach, this is the approach that basically says that there's something almost divinely, it was almost, not care about moral duty is a kind of impiety almost. So more important for this approach is the task of circumscribing very carefully the scope of genuine moral duty. This is because without clear circumscription, the demands of that kind of morality or that attitude to morality can easily seem or be overwhelmingly consuming for all but a very few. But attaching great importance to a clear boundary of what does really fall within the scope of a moral demand and what doesn't, and attaching a special quasi-religious importance to what lies within that boundary can, although it doesn't have to, can lead to a sort of flattening out of everything outside the boundary. It's as if everything within the boundary is sacred and everything outside the boundary is just profane, and that's the end of the story. It can come to seem as if all outside undertakings are straightforwardly just optional, and not only that, but even in themselves objectively of neutral worth. And this can easily develop into the position that each of them is valuable just to the extent of fitting in with a preference which the particular agent happens to have. And here, of course, we have come a very long way indeed from Aristotle. Williams's dialectic about morality, the peculiar institution, his phrase, crucially depends on the full secularization of morality. By accepting its secularization through and through, Williams was able to discern, or anyway so he thought, the real possibility that morality, such a deeply important but nonetheless fully human set of practices and attitudes, is something that individuals might on occasion reasonably set aside in pursuit of one or another kind of deeply important human concern. By contrast, and interestingly, Aristotle's dialectic in defense of his theoretical ideal depends in part on the argument that although the great political leader is indeed godlike, Aristotle actually says that in the Ethics, the brilliant philosopher or scientist is more godlike still. And by the way, I don't know whether this was a consideration in Aristotle's mind, but it seems to me that that argument works whether or not one, I mean, it has some force whether or not one actually believes in an actual God. We might think that whatever a God is supposed to be, that is an ideal which can be, as it were, real as an ideal, whether or not there's any being that actually matches that ideal. I've just been considering whether Williams-style skepticism about the overridingness of moral duty is a tool to be reached for by someone who wants to defend Aristotle's stance on the theoretical ideal. And I've argued that the defender does not need that tool. I'm now going to look at Aristotle's position in the light of another typically Williamsian question. In a general form, this is the question of what we should say when there is a possible divergence between the principles and the kind of motivation that control or even define some practice or institution or attitude or disposition on the one hand, and the principles and type of motivation that come into play when the value of the entire practice or attitude or whatever it is up for assessment. Now, the picture to which Williams most famously applies this question is that of common sense morality on the one hand, and on the other hand, what Williams called government house consequentialism. In Williams's picture, government house, of course, the whole concept of government house has sort of gone away almost entirely since we lost our colonies, etc. But anyway, in Williams's picture, government house, for purely consequentialist reasons, upholds the existence of common sense or traditional morality, complete with its beliefs that right action in signal instances is not determined by reference to the general consequences, and its conviction that we should do what is right just because it's right, and that we should encourage and admire conduct from this motive in others. Now, an interesting point about this situation, already discussed by Sidgwick, is that life on the common sense level would run better, or so it seems plausible to think, if its participants remain locked in their belief that common sense morality, with its emphasis on the pure motive of duty, is the whole story about how people should live. If so, then government house would need to keep its own position secret from the people. This is the interesting point that Sidgwick brought out. This follows because it's not enough, logically, for government house simply to have its own aims or its own aim. Government house can't make sense to itself unless it endorses its consequentialist aim as a practical ought. But that, of course, amounts to endorsing a distinct morality of its own. So government house has one morality, the little people have a different one. Trying to keep this a secret would have political implications repugnant to most of us. This, of course, is in addition to difficulties arising for inmates of government house who have family or friends outside, or even who lived outside themselves for quite a long time. The best solution to this problem, although hardly one that could be kept secret, would be the system of Plato's Republic, whereby children with potential to become leaders are separately educated from a very early age. But like many other arrangements in Plato's Republic, this, thankfully, at least in any society that we can sort of imagine breathing in ourselves, this thankfully remains an impossible ideal. I'm not so sure, however, that secrecy about the double standard is in principle necessary for things to run well. If the ordinary people could be counted on by everyone concerned to operate, or enough of them, to operate in terms of common sense morality, no matter what, and if government house could be counted on by everyone concerned to continue to see this as the best means of achieving its own objectives, then both sides, in principle, should find this a satisfactory symbiosis in which each operates exactly as it thinks it should. But the ifs that I've just hurtled in the previous sentence are as far removed from human reality as, I think, the assumptions of Plato's Republic. Now, I want now to ask whether similar questions arise when we look at some of Aristotle's remarks about theoretical activity. And here, refer you to passage 1, which I'll just read out as well. So he says in the Politics, both in the case of individuals and in that of whole cities, courage and endurance are required for the unleisurely part of life, and philosophy is required for leisure. Temperance and justice are required for both the unleisurely part and the leisurely part. And especially all these are required in times of peace and leisure, for war compels people to be just and temperate, whereas the enjoyment of good fortune and the leisure that comes with peace tend to make them insolent. Those who seem to be the best off and to be in possession of every blessing have special need of justice and temperance. For example, those, if such there be, who, as the poets say, dwell in the islands of the blessed, they, above all, will need philosophy and temperance and justice, and all the more leisure, and all the more leisure they have. The more leisure they have, living in the midst of abundance, that is, because they live in abundance, they have more leisure. There is no difficulty in seeing why the state that would be happy and good ought to have those excellences. If it's disgraceful in people not to be able to use good things, he means, of course, use good things well, it's still more disgraceful not to be able to use them well in times of leisure, to show ourselves excellent in unleisurely times and in war, but in peacetime and leisure to show ourselves no better than slaves. And Aristotle then goes on to cite the contemporary Sparta as an illustration of this kind of moral failure. They kind of, they were traditionally very brave and disciplined and so on in warfare, but as soon as they sort of rose to a kind of more or less stable sort of supremacy anyway for a kind, they kind of fell apart morally. Anyway, that's what the Athenians said quite a lot of about the Spartans. Now, my question is Aristotle here proposing theoretical activity, that is philosophy in the quotation, in the city, as a safety valve for draining off the excess of material goods? And if so, is there anything sinister in such a proposal? I have to admit that this passage from the Politics by itself does not particularly prompt a suspicious reading. On the other hand, anyone who comes to it fresh from some of Williams's discussions might well want to pause and to sort of sniff around it for any possibly disturbing implications. This is what I shall do, but first we need to consider, I think briefly really, whether Aristotle would here be contradicting some things he says elsewhere about theoretical wisdom. So the second passage, which I think I've really just given a paraphrase of, in Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he raises the following puzzle. Given that practical wisdom rules and gives orders about everything, that's a kind of sort of cliche which we're just expected to accept, doesn't it follow that practical wisdom is going to be in charge of theoretical wisdom? But how can that be, given that comparing theoretical and practical wisdom, it's clear that, he's already made this clear in Book 6, it's clear that practical wisdom is inferior. So how can the inferior, as it were, give orders to the superior? Aristotle's solution is that even if practical wisdom gives orders about everything, which it's supposed to do, it doesn't follow that it gives orders to everything. It doesn't use theoretical wisdom for the sake of some further end in the way that we use medicine for the sake of health, but on the contrary, what it does, practical wisdom, it gives orders for the sake of theoretical wisdom. Then in Book 10, and this is the third passage, quite a short one, he emphasizes that political actions seek a distinct end beyond themselves, whether this distinct end is power and honors or happiness for the leader himself and the citizens, or for the citizens or whatever. Whereas by contrast, the exercise of theoretical wisdom seeks no end beyond itself and therefore is the most perfect form of happiness. Now, I obviously don't want to get into details, but both of these passages are open to more than one interpretation. In the Book 6 passage, passage 2, he might be taken as saying that it's not for practical wisdom to tell theoretical wisdom how to do research or what research to do. This, an embryonic form of the principle of academic freedom, is surely compatible with the idea that practical or political wisdom should be very glad to take advantage of and even exploit theoretical activities' ability to soak up what might otherwise be a dangerous excess of leisure and material goods in the society. And this could be further developed into the idea that as far as wise rulers are concerned, this safety valve function is the reason why the state should look benignly on theoretical activity. And with this development, we may be heading for a contradiction between the theoreticians and the politicians' understandings of the value of what the theoreticians do. However, the Book 10 passage can be taken as saying that the success of excellent political action depends on its achieving whatever further good it was aiming for whether military victory, provision against famine, or whatever. Whereas the success of a piece of theoretical research depends entirely on whether it sets itself good questions and answers them well, or something like that, regardless of further consequences. Now, on this interpretation, it is in principle an open question whether the theoreticians engage in the research just because they value this kind of activity for its own sake and only for its own sake, or whether they do so as a service. I know this is obviously sort of a weird possibility, but whether they do so as a service to the state, a hygienic service that helps keep the city free from the arrogance bred by wealth and idleness. Even where an activity's criterion of success is rigorously internal, this is Alistair MacIntyre's way of putting it, the motive for engaging in the activity at all may look to the consequences of doing so and be entirely determined by the consequences. However, even if Aristotle had distinguished between the motive for engaging in theoretical activity at all and the criterion for excellent engagement, given that we do engage, and it's far from clear that he did make such a distinction, I'm sure his view would be that true theoretical wisdom engages in its own characteristic activity out of love of it for its own sake. But would he have any good reason to think this if he were to allow that doing it from an impure motive does not entail a lowering of the internal standards of success? Would the thought be that although a lowering of standards is not entailed, nonetheless, experience shows that having the impure motive for engaging in the activity at all may very well lead to a lowering of standards. But is that true? This is an empirical claim, and one that it would be very difficult to be sure whether it's true or even roughly true. I believe that as far as Aristotle himself is concerned, this worry about standards is beside the point, or anyway is not the main point. I think that what would stick in his throat is the fact that by engaging in the activity of theoretical wisdom for the sake ultimately of order in the community, one would after all be subordinating theoretical wisdom to political wisdom or practical wisdom, and this would be abhorrent to him even if it were somehow guaranteed that this mode of subordination would never develop into one that ended up twisting the internal standards of theoretical research. It is less than godlike to engage in the activity of theoretical wisdom from anything but the sheer love of it. I mean, God doesn't, certainly Aristotle's God doesn't, as it were, do anything for the sake of an ulterior end. What he or it just does is its end. Aristotle's God can have no other activity than something like the activity of theoretical wisdom, and no other motive for engaging in it other than just that engaging it is what it is. And Aristotle wants human beings, or at least some human beings, to be as godlike as they can. Yes, of course, human theoretical activity is something that can function as a safety valve for the superfluity of wealth. But Aristotle's line on this would surely be that this is simply a side effect, the safety valve function, and that any theoretician who allowed the side effect to become his or her central motive or objective in leading the theoretical life would show terrible misunderstanding. Such a stance would imply that theoretical activity is a sort of bloodletting of affluence, or a fire blanket for throwing at material superfluity, although not one that would necessarily be more effective for the supposed purpose than if civic leaders used up the community's extra wealth on mindless entertainments for the masses, making sure, of course, that these mindless entertainments were peaceful and didn't incapacitate people for ordinary practical duties and cultivating the practical virtues. Instead, Aristotle surely thinks that if peaceful and virtuous societies tend to over-generate wealth, this is because, in the overall scheme of things, such superfluity has a purpose, its purpose being to support philosophy and the theoretical sciences. This perspective assumes a kind of natural teleology of leisure. Human leisure, superfluous, or in a way superfluous, affluence is for the sake of making leisure possible, and human leisure has its own rightful purpose or end, whether or not one is aware of it and whether or not one desires that end. So, just a short parenthetical point, Aristotle here, and no doubt elsewhere, would be implicitly embracing an idea which Bernard Williams is probably best known for rejecting, namely the idea that there are external reasons for choosing something rather than something else. Yes, of course, by consuming some of the superfluity, theoretical activity does prevent wealth, a natural good, from becoming an evil, but the right way to do this is not by treating theoretical activity as a sort of dumping ground into which politicians can sink superfluity so as to make it harmless, so as to make superfluity harmless. But the right way to deal with the superfluity problem is by having people treat it as a powerfully positive good, that is, a positive power for supporting higher studies. So let me expand on this point just a little. It's natural to treat prosperity as a great good, not just, for example, as the Stoics said, as a so-called preferred indifferent. It's natural to treat prosperity as a great good. We expend so much time and effort in trying to avoid its opposite. But given the tendency to excess and the dangers consequent on excess, how can we make it still true that prosperity really is a good? That it is a good is a basic assumption on which almost everyone everywhere operates, including, of course, the poor and the least educated. It seems to me that Aristotle lines up theoretical activity as the preferred candidate for the role of occupying prosperity-funded leisure. In doing this, he's solving the problem of how to make sure that basic and natural assumption, namely that prosperity really is a good thing, that assumption is or remains true. We preserve its truth not by treating superfluous prosperity as a potential evil, a force which, grown beyond a certain point, needs to be choked back and damped down so that from there on, instead of having effects, it has no effects or none that add anything to life that deserve a sensible person's interest. But instead, we preserve the truth of the maxim that prosperity is good by having civic leaders who use excess to promote new, noble enterprises, for example, the pursuit of theoretical wisdom, and who promote these just because they are noble. For consider civic leaders who approve of or tolerate the pursuit of theoretical wisdom simply as a safety valve. This attitude of theirs unconsciously calls into question the universal assumption that prosperity, or almost universal assumption, that prosperity is a great good. And yet leaders invoke this very assumption at every turn in making and executing policy. Hence, civic leaders escape self-contradiction only if they admire and value the theoretical pursuits for their own sake. There is a further Aristotelian reason why civic leaders should cultivate this attitude in themselves and the city at large. Given that a society at peace and not crippled by poverty or some other major cause of backwardness, such a society with these relatively fortunate circumstances can be expected, if it practices, or on the whole practices, the practical virtues, to increase its holdings and become much richer in just a few generations. Now, that seems to be just sort of a fairly true historical kind of generalization. From this, people may easily draw the eventually corrupting lesson that the real value of general virtuous practice lies in its wealth-generating tendency. According to Aristotle, it was exactly something like this that went wrong with the Spartans in the early 4th century. But if the civic mind accepts that the exercise of one noble quality, namely theoretical wisdom, has its value entirely in itself, since it explicitly and on every level aims to generate nothing beyond itself, then the city has one uniquely clear example to help it maintain a non-instrumentalist attitude towards virtuous activity in general, and therefore towards virtuous practical activity. If the civic leaders share this attitude, that will help them to be less vulnerable to temptations to use their position to pile up personal wealth and power, and to the extent, which ideally for Aristotle is a very large extent, to the extent that they are concerned for moral education of future citizens, it will help them uphold an unconfused standard concerning the value, the intrinsic value of virtuous activity in general. And that, of course, civic leaders who, as it were, have absorbed and are putting into practice this lesson are thereby have become better civic leaders. Yes, the activity of the virtuous civic leader, civic leader ought to recognize this. His or her activity is a pinnacle of human life and happiness. Such leaders are doing pretty well for themselves. It's just that there is, according to Aristotle, a yet higher pinnacle for them to recognize and a more perfect form of happiness. Returning in conclusion to Bernard Williams, I shall briefly consider a situation quite different from this Aristotelian ideal. The situation I'm going to consider is one in which an unenlightened political leadership merely tolerates the theoretical life of some of the citizens as being harmless and as absorbing the otherwise dangerous energy of some of the sort of Alcibiades-type characters of this world. Whereas the theoreticians themselves, these are analogous to the little people vis-à-vis government house, whereas in what I'm considering now, the theoreticians themselves value what they do just for its own sake. This, of course, parallels government house consequentialism in relation to common sense morality. Now, in connection with the government house common sense sort of contrast, I said that although the moral views on these two sort of echelons contradict each other, knowledge of this fact on either side is perhaps not inevitably a threat, because we can conceive of a situation in which such shared knowledge, a situation of such shared knowledge, in which each side promotes the aims of the other by simply carrying on as it thinks that it should, We can, however, easily understand why in the real world Sidgwick would advise Government House to keep its policy and indeed its morality secret. But it's less obvious why in the parallel case it would be wiser if unenlightened leaders, that is by their own standard of wisdom, if they were to conceal, not clear that it would be wiser for them to conceal from the theoreticians their own very different evaluation of theoretical activity. You know, it's okay for you very clever people to just go and play, and we're fine with that because it sort of destabilizes things less. No doubt it would be better for the theoreticians if the politicians prized the activity of theoreticians just for its own sake, because then they would be more willing to fund it. But in the scenario that I'm considering, the politicians tolerate it simply as a safety valve, as suggested before, a safety valve for the energy of very clever people who might otherwise make trouble. And my question here is whether this whole situation would be a better one for the politicians, in other words, from their point of view as political managers, if they, like Government House in the parallel case, hypocritically pretended to share the values of the theoreticians. I'm not sure that I see that it would be better for them to take on that hypocrisy. But if there is a difference between the two cases, which I've tried to draw an analogy between, does that difference suggest anything of philosophical significance? This might be a question for further discussion by anyone interested in comparing Williams's take with other takes on the view from Government House. Thank you.